All right. Thank you to our speakers. Your presentations were amazing. Thank you guys so much both for being here. Quickly, before we get into our question and answer session, just a reminder to folks, please submit your questions that you have for Kamal and for Gregory. We have lots of great questions for the both of you, so I hope you're ready. And also, please join us after our break today at 1 o'clock for our second round of ACES fellowship presentations. Okay. So, also one last announcement. We are recording this event and it will be posted on the ACES website in a couple weeks, right? Right, yeah. Okay, so Dr. Kamal, thank you so much for being here with us today. I know it is so early where you are, so really appreciate you being here with us and having time for the question and answers. I have a couple questions for you, so I'm going to start with this one. What can American consumers do to support worldwide indigenous peoples and local communities in resisting the development pressure of the global economy?
Thanks, Shante. Good morning to you all. It's about 2 o'clock here. So I think it's not just America, but the whole Western world has to look at the economy model, how we operate to support the cultural ecosystem services or our ecosystems for the indigenous people and local communities, as well as for many of us, because they deliver services for all of us. I loved Gregory's talk because it highlights the benefits that we all get. So it really needs a big shift in our economic structures. The way corporations have been exploiting the natural resources and the way we need to turn around. And still our governments are not able to get their head around this. I'm not aware about American situation, but in Australia, we do have some offset policies, but they're not mandatory. So people for mining can go ahead without actually offsetting at sometimes the losses that they cause to the natural systems. So if we start understanding the picture of economy at a bigger level, I guess then we can achieve much better. But until we do that, it's very hard to obtain any substantial outcomes.
Great. Now I've got a question for Dr. Bratman. From our audience, someone mentions that they appreciate the pictures of serene mountain scenes and the disturbing image of urban congestion. And if people vote with their feet, why do so many people choose to live in urban settings? Please discuss your expectations of future trends given our increased ability to work remotely.
Well, so great question. And something I first of all, thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be here with you all. And I really appreciate all the perspectives brought to this. And as I opened my talk with, I don't think by any means, I think it's a very sort of narrow perspective that needs a lot of broadening. So with that perspective in mind, I think it's important to keep in mind that cities do provide lots of benefits to people, and that can often go, at least in my work in particular, sort of unaccounted for, or not enough attention's paid to that, I think. And so there are many sorts of other types of services that cities provide. So that's one part of an answer to that question. The kind of forces of urbanization, if you will. I'm no expert in how that works across the globe, but I can tell you that I think nearly all projections show that this trend is sort of projected to continue. And if you take a country like the U.S., we're well above, I believe it's 80% urbanized, and that's continuing as well. So with remote work, I can't speak to that. It seems like some early kind of anecdotal trends are showing that may have an impact of a move out of cities, but urban environments in the work that I do include kind of suburban areas as well. And in many respects, those kinds of areas are not necessarily using land in an optimal way when it comes to access to green space either. So not sure that answered the question.
Thank you. That was good. It was great. Okay, so I have another question for you, Dr. Kamal. Okay,
Sure.
This question says, how might, oh, can you hear me? Okay. How might we define a minimum flow of cultural services in different areas so that payments for ecosystem services can have a set boundary where access can be made into a market without restricting citizens from a minimal entitlement of public good?
It's hard to answer, and it has to be place specific. How people value their cultural landscapes. So if it's a common asset, so the situation is quite different here because we got Aboriginal people living across the landscape, and they got Aboriginal land trusts. So usually you should have special permission to visit any Aboriginal land trust. Their large areas could be owned by any more than like 10, 20 clan groups. So what the government did when they couldn't work out the land belongs to whom, they put that land together as a trust for all the clans. So what that has led to is that we got huge areas of land trusts, such as maybe 10,000 square kilometers, even more than that. So those people have got regulation. They got the rights to let other people come in or go. Ideally, that should be the case, but it doesn't happen. Many of us, when we visit those places, we often visit the land trusts if we are in that place. So we don't normally seek special permission because people are welcoming in the way they kind of entertain the other visitors. Pitch could be kind of different if we think that we develop those cultural ecosystem services kind of markets. And I think that upsets the notion. I'm not completely for marketing those ecosystem services in favor of that kind of agenda, but more that we develop the incentives so those who have got those connections, so they're able to look after their landscape while delivering those services to many other people. So it's developing the incentive mechanisms, which you can say the market kind of mechanisms, where we can support those people living on their land to develop and look after their land in a better way, so that they can keep on delivering those services for themselves as well as for many of us. So the beauty about this mechanism is that it enables and empowers those indigenous peoples and local communities to be on their land. It's not like they have to move to urban places to find a job. And secondly, all of us, we receive multiple benefits, biodiversity benefits, climate change, decline in climate change or mitigating climate change, and also enables Aboriginal people and local communities actually to pass on their knowledge to the next generation, which otherwise they wouldn't get an opportunity. So developing the right kind of incentives, I guess, is the main thing, not to develop the strict market mechanisms in a way that will actually alienate people or bring it into that market space. That's my gut feeling.
Great. I've got a question.
Thank you so much.
Got a question for both of you to answer that falls onto that just a little bit. Someone wanted to know what suggestions that you have for non-monetary valuations for the nature people interaction benefits. Dr. Bratman, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So a lot of times the way at least mental health is thought about in the work that I do involves a paradigm of avoidance of disease or disorder. And so it's kind of a more simple path from that to a valuation that could involve economic metrics. But what goes overlooked a lot of the times is that not just a decrease in the bad, so to speak, but a provision of the good. And so by that, I mean things like psychological well-being, fulfillment, happiness, and these are things that are harder to put an economic metric on. So that bin of benefits, so to speak, I would say needs a lot more attention in terms of empirical evidence that we gather and about how we think about trade-offs and valuing those benefits. And ultimately, it can extend all the way up to things like meaning in life. So they're pretty important to pay attention to. And as we see in the other work presented today, very difficult to put certain types of monetary valuation on. So, but when it comes to kind of dailies and other sort of public health metrics of avoided health burden, I think that's a more straightforward path. It's just important to keep in mind what we're excluding when we do that.
So can I just add to that, Emily,
Please.
that some of the work that we've been doing here is that I have estimated some cost savings for the Australian government in this space. So that's another way to influence government decision making or policy decision making, actually to suggest them if we invest in these kind of mechanism, this is how much we can save the cost for, as Gregory highlighted, because ultimately it's enhancing people's well-being and saving the costs or the burden on the government. Any other questions?
Do we have time for one more? Do we have time for one more? Yep. Okay, good. Okay. All right. So, okay, here's one more question for you, Dr. Kamal. How large, approximate area are the sacred grounds in India?
So, I mean, there are many sacred groves, but the area could be even 0.1 hectare. So that's the minimum size, and it can go up to 100 hectares. But the beauty about those sacred groves is, so I come from northwestern part of India, but they used to be, as a child, I have seen them embedded in the agricultural landscape, but they're no more now. But they are in the other states where development hasn't happened at that level. So the beauty about these is quite often when you go to some of these places, they will have, some of those trees that used to be common in the landscape. And these are quite large trees, quite valuable for fauna. And obviously, they will have some medicinal value, which otherwise, if we would have ruined, like the destruction has happened due to development pressure at other places, if these sacred groves would have gone, India would have lost a lot of its diversity. So we haven't actually valued sacred groves to that extent, the value they are holding for the whole nation. Still, there are not special policies in place to look after sacred groves. It's only the local communities and the Adivasi people who are taking their own effort and lead to look after their sacred groves. They're wonderful places to be in, very small patches, but people got their rituals attached to them, so they will visit quite often, annual ritual attached to these places. So those people who have got their clan or relationships with a particular sacred grove, they will be visiting that grove every year. And even if the sons or grandsons living somewhere in big cities, they will have to come back to visit that place. So it's that special. And with time, that responsibility is kind of lacking because earlier it was like the particular grove will be looked after that particular group of people who are responsible to look after. But now people either sometimes assign those duties to hire somebody to live in that area to look after the grove. So they develop some mechanisms, and there is a little government interference in this case. But that also leads to little recognition of the importance of these sacred groves. Quite fascinating things when you visit some of these, yeah.
Great, thank you. So I've got one more question coming in, very relevant for the times, about how the global COVID pandemic has affected the relationship between human well-being and nature. And in Washington, D.C., we see many more folks out at parks and lines to get into the national parks that are within driving distance that are many, many cars long. And like each of you to comment if you think that this is a phenomenon that will continue, and if you think there'll be any evidence of a change in actual well-being and nature from this pandemic. So Dr. Bratman, do you want to start with that question?
Sure. So I think it's too early to tell if we know kind of any empirical data about how the parks have helped through COVID-19 pandemic, but I think it's striking to note that people have sought out nature the way they have. In a certain sense, it sort of is proof of what we all already know, that that these areas and landscapes help buffer against stressors in our lives. I think that crowding and other challenges have presented a number of interesting things to think about that we should pay attention to. One is just the complicated health picture that presents. So going outside and being in a crowd is different than going outside and not being in a crowd when it comes to health precautionary steps to take during a pandemic. So we need to pay attention to that. But it's also brought up a lot of kind of embedded cultural approaches and almost gatekeeping to our natural areas, and kind of brought them up to the surface a bit about the kind of dominant norms, if you will, about, you know, what's accepted behavior in these spaces and things like that. And I think that's going to take some time for us to really examine. But you know, what are the ways in which kind of expected behavior has become operationalized when it comes to public green space, and what are the biases that are baked into that, and how can we try to move past that and become more inclusive in the ways in which we provide these spaces to people. So I think that's come up in a variety of different ways, and we're only, I think, just beginning to try to think through lessons that we can learn from that, as so many people from so many different walks of life have sought out nearby nature. So yeah, I think it's a complicated picture, but a learning opportunity as well, and an opportunity to kind of move forward with important steps towards change that we need to make.
Great, thank you. Dr. Sangha, can you comment on that?
Sure. So from Australian or Northern Territory perspective, where I live, so we probably enjoyed better relationship with nature this year than we would have done before, because we got 26% indigenous population. So our borders were cut off to rest of Australia quite early, which actually helped our Aboriginal communities, as are highlighted in those maps. So we got about 96 within the NT, 96 indigenous communities. So to protect especially those people, and also not to let this spread happen, so it helped people living in communities to be in touch and learning in touch with their landscape, and to probably learn a bit more while being contained in those communities. So it helped people here. So when we had about 2 weeks lockdown, so not any more than that. So it was lifted around 17th of June, if I remember correctly. And we had long queues going to the national parks, as you are seeing now. But now people are enjoying more about the natural landscape. And I have heard stories from India too, because the state where I used to live, we could never see the mountain tops with snows. And people have posted pictures on social media that now, with less pollution, cities like New Delhi had much less pollution due to COVID-19. You could see actually from the plains, like the foothills of Himalayas, the top and the middle range covered with snow. So there has been some good things that has happened. And maybe if we all control a little bit of travel that we usually do, I think it will help the world. Ultimately, all of us.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I want to thank you both again for being here with us today, for sharing your work, and especially, I know you're both in time zones that aren't quite conducive, but we really appreciate it. We're excited to have these topics highlighted, and perhaps we can get you to Florida next year. Like I said yesterday, we'll miss the opportunity for lunch and picking your brains more. But again, hopefully next year that's something that can happen. And I want to remind folks, please join us again at 1 o'clock Eastern for our next fellow session, which will conclude with some wrap up from Shantae and I, and also Dr. Carl Shapiro, who has been a long-standing and foundational leader in ACES. And so we'll hear his thoughts on this and what the future looks like. Thank you all.
And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Yes, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.